probably introduce a caveat here at the beginning to clarify that I'm not, with this response, officially conferring my organization's consecration of this book. However, that's the only caveat that there will be
Thought we might slip that
in this discussion. I'm rather speaking as a longtime colleague, a fellow ethnomusicologist, and someone who studies music from another part of the same continent. And so it's in these rules that I urge you to go out and buy and read this wonderful book, whose contributions include a compelling ethnography of the music of Swahili-speaking Muslims in Kenya, an extension of a growing literature on music and the Indian Ocean, an expansion of ethnomusicology's engagement with the legacies of Jacobson and Bakhtin, an ethnographically informed hermeneutic approach to hybridization in music, and a welcoming new approach to a new framing of the concept of appropriation, exploring musical borrowing not as a kind of problematic vertical plundering, but rather as a more horizontal and egalitarian kind of reuse. Sounds of Other Shores examines the music of Swahili-speaking Muslims along the coast of Kenya. This group is part of a larger coastal population that stretches in the south from Tanzania, including the island of Zanzibar, through Kenya and into southern Somalia. It's a population made up of people of Bantu, Arab, and Indian Ocean descents, and its heterogeneity has often confounded systems of categorization, whether those of colonists, anthropologists, or the post-colonial Kenyan state. Its musical focus, the musical focus of the book, is Tarab, a genre of poetry sung in Swahili that became an early East African popular music. As its name suggests, Tarab is deeply shaped by Arab music, and some of you may recognize the name from A.J. Rassi's book. But it also contains elements of, or better, makes pointed reference to, other Indian Ocean musics and to Bantu music. A central argument of the book is that these musical appropriations have been a way for Swahili-speaking Muslims to both reflect on and constitute complex hybrid identities. The book has an introduction and an epilogue and 7 chapters, and each of the chapters draws on ethnographic evidence and a close engagement with the recorded musical legacy of Swahili-speaking Muslims. There's also a companion website where I spent many hours, where readers can access the 35 recordings discussed in the book. The 7 chapters proceed historically from the 1930s to the present day. So chapter 1 looks at early recordings from the years between the First and Second World Wars. Chapter 2 considers radio broadcasts from the 1950s, including music that brought the intimate domestic sounds of lullabies out into the public sphere. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 highlight Tarab in the second half of the 20th century, considering variants of the music that respectively emphasized appropriations from Indian, Hadrami, and Arab music. Chapter 6 considers trajectory for Tarab in the new century, including a much less contemplative, more dance-oriented form of Tarab called modern Tarab, and a kind of heritage-ized Tarab with a smaller audience. Chapter 7 then looks at a completely new form of music, or a completely different form of music, looks at hip-hop, and considers the degree to which it undertakes similar kinds of identity work. For me, one of the book's most valuable contributions lies in its hermeneutic or interpretative approach. It's a strategy that seems to me to be very well suited to a project that combines ethnographic and historical study, and that concerns itself both with intimate communities and the publicly circulating recordings that they produce. So in short, once these recordings are out and circulating, when they can engage with multiple populations, very different kinds of receptions, it seems appropriate to bring a kind of hermeneutic perspective, an interpretive perspective like the one Andy brings to them. This hermeneutic perspective also seems to me to be deeply appropriate to the community from which it emerges. So the author invites us to hear performances from across the history of Tarab as deploying appropriations that reflect on, mediate, and stage complex hybrid identities. These songs and their appropriations are, to quote the author, artistic acts oriented towards reflecting upon, objectifying, playing with, ironizing the processes by which cultures change historically. Shortly after I began reading this book, I went to see a concert. I went to hear a concert, Mahler's Fifth Symphony, and either that performance strongly affected how I read the book, or how I was reading the book strongly affected how I heard that performance. Maybe both. What struck me in particular was this uncanny moment in the third movement, where suddenly this massive orchestra is replaced by a few solo players playing very quietly, a kind of waltz. And what struck me was the way that the music seemed to be saying, listen to me, interpret me. I'm unusual, I'm important, I'm meaningful. And sure enough, when I checked later, there were all sorts of people that had written about exactly this moment that seemed to cry out, invite interpretation. And that performance helped bring into focus how the book I was reading takes an interpretive approach similar to ones that we might be used to seeing more in historical musicology or in popular music studies. So don't worry, I'm not about to claim that we're all musicologists now. Rather, I want to point out how Eisenberg advances interpretations of sounds and processes in the music that don't always reference or defer to specific local interpretations of the variety. My interviewee told me that this sound means this thing. In short, the practice of interpretation in this volume goes beyond some of the more cautious kinds of interpretation that we as ethnomusicologists are liable to take and that are prevalent in contemporary ethnomusicology. So it doesn't begin and end with insiders' interpretations of musical meanings, although those are obviously very important. And this isn't a criticism on my part. In fact, the approach seems defensible not only given the historical nature of the study, but also and especially the social and cultural context in which it was undertaken. First, this is a study in part of music of the past, and many of the performers and their contemporaneous listeners are no longer alive. The author did conduct interviews with older musicians and older listeners, but you're in the same position as many other historians. There are a few people around who can interpret music as it was heard in the 1930s, and even quite a bit later. Second, as Andy writes, speaking about the Indian Ocean world does not come easy. The complex cultural hybridity of the Swahili coast has simply not been theorized to the same extent as you point out, as the Black Atlantic. It's accordingly, nor has that kind of discourse been circulated and democratized and shared among musicians to the same extent that Black Atlantic discourses have been. It's accordingly through musical sounds, rather than only talk, that Swahili-speaking Muslims often reflect on and constitute their complex hybrid identities. Third, and perhaps a little bit in tension with the preceding point, the Tarab that is the subject of this book nevertheless invites interpretation and discussion. It has historically been a contemplative art, as you point out, one that invites reflection and sense-making. In Swahili Muslim contexts, the allegorical indirection of a text generated collective critical discussion regarding its meanings. And Eisenberg encourages us to consider the possibility that music is doing the same thing, that when music is difficult or invites interpretation, that it's opening a door to discussion. So his book, referring back to this experience, this musical experience I had, can thus be understood as a reflection on striking musical moments that make demands of listeners. Listen to me, pay attention to me. I'm unusual, I'm meaningful. More broadly, the interpretations in it are culturally appropriate responses because they're responses to cultural prompts or invitations to reflect, invitations to make sense. What are the advantages of this approach? I'll mention the two that seem to be the most clearly emphasized. The first is that it understands music not simply to mirror existing cultural hybridity, but rather to reflect critically on it and even constitute, put together, assemble that hybridity. To quote Andy, Tara fostered critical reflection on the new social imaginary it was helping to create. Second, it allows us to hear in musical structures the cultural agency of musicians as they reflect on and frame their experiences of migration and exchange, and to hear this not only in the words but in the sounds of the music. I'll leave my reflections there. Congratulations to Andy on a wonderful book that invites us to hear musicians inviting us to hear meaningful musical appropriations.
Can I just remind everyone that the BFE has a book prize, and so this will be eligible for the next book prize in every 2 years. We'll be announcing the winner on Saturday. And we're also at the AGM. We're also announcing the incoming chair at the AGM, so you might want to be there.
Good reminder. You write a book to get this kind of reading. I mean, this is what we do. So this was a profound experience hearing these comments from my colleague here. Yeah, I'm not going to try to follow it up by giving you my spiel on it, especially since you're all being so generous standing here without proper libations. Actually, it makes me feel at home. I'm sure Carlos and I, my colleague at NYWW, we can't also, have those proper libations where we are. I'll just say that, so thank you all again for celebrating this with me. This is also a book, and this happens in our profession, and it's a privilege we have. This is a book that has 20 years of history behind the actual research and writing of the book. Then I talk about, I go 70 years back in terms of the history, but there's, a lot of my life is in this book. I mean, during that time, I did other things, I undertook other research, but I never fully put this aside. So it's been, and I'm not putting it aside now, actually. It has an afterlife. Where I am at NYWW, we're continuing to do research on the Indian Ocean world and music, and this book has a new life in there. So I wanted to mention that. I had a whole set of notes about the interventions, but like I said, I think Byron beautifully laid out what the book is trying to do, what I hope it does. I'll say that those 20 years, if I have the privilege of having you all as readers too, I invite you to read the lengthy acknowledgement section, which gives you a sense of the dialogues and the kind of the debts that I owe to my interlocutors. We just had someone, a musician who's featured in the book, come to campus in Abu Dhabi and perform with some other musicians from the region. And he reminded me that we hadn't seen each other for almost 15 years, and it was a profound experience to kind of continue that dialogue. I'll mention before I forget, at the book station there are discount codes, so there's a pretty hefty discount that you can get. There's a bunch of flyers, pick one up. And I'll just end by saying thank you again to Byron, to Jonathan, and to all of you for listening, and to all of you for reading, I hope. And I see a lot of new faces. BFE has been a home to me since I did some work at Oxford and I joined the society, and now I'm physically still closer to this part of the world than I am to the United States, and I consider it a home institution. but I think it's actually a good thing that, and not just now because of ICTMD here, but also last year I noticed that there's a whole new generation, and I felt slightly out of place, like I don't know everyone anymore. But actually, I think it's great. I think and I want to get to know all of you, and so please come out, have a drink, and let's do that. Thank you again, and I'll see you around.